Hey everyone, I'm Ryan, welcome to Two Car Pros, and today we're going to be taking a look at how to replace the front CV axle for a Ford 2002 F-150. This also applies to Expeditions around that era, and probably all Ford SUVs around that era if I'm being honest, but I know for sure it's on the full-size truck bodies. This is pretty simple and straightforward. You do need a 12.12 millimeter socket. It's kind of the only special tool you're going to need, and a breaker bar, and most likely someone to help you hold the hub with a big pry bar or something to get those tricky bolts out. I do show how to do that later on in this film. This is also for the driver's side. The passenger side is exactly the same. I just happen to only need to do it on the driver's side, but trust me, the passenger side is exactly the same. This is something that is a little bit more advanced. It's a little trickier, but still totally doable in a garage type situation with the jack stands and some jacks. With all that out of the way, all the applicable links are down below in the description. I've left those there for you, but let's go ahead and jump in. So before we get started, I thought it'd be prevalent to show you what a, CV axle that needs replacing looks like. This one is pretty darn obvious. You can rotate the rotor here and, see that it has these giant openings, but sometimes it's not so obvious and the holes are smaller, but the dead giveaway is a buildup of grease surrounding the boot, and sometimes it's this boot and sometimes it's that boot. Either way, the CV axle is going to need a replacement. The first thing you need to do to take the CV axle out is actually to remove basically the front brake here. You can leave it attached. You don't need to take the brake line off or anything, but hang it in a way that is not going to put tension on that line. And these are 13 millimeters, so we need to remove that so we can get the caliper off. If you want a really in-depth video on how to do the brakes on this truck, I did that a little while back. That's up there in the card, and I'm going to try to remember to put in the description as well. Okay, so we can remove our brake caliper here and put that up and out of the way. We can readjust it later. Now we can remove our brake pads and set those aside. So these two bolts here that hold the caliper mounting bracket, those are 18 millimeters, so we need to remove those as well. And these are on pretty snug. Okay, with the breaker bar loaded, we can remove these because they're pretty snug, Yeah, those were not coming off without the breaker bar. Alright, the next thing we can do is remove the rotor, and be careful not to drop it on your foot. So the next thing we can do is remove this cotter pin here. You can even close your eyes and just snip off one of the legs. Makes it a little easier to remove. There we go. So we can remove this. So you can see that this design's a little weird. So the castle nut is actually like a little castle collar, like this. And you remove that, and then you need to remove this spindle nut here. All right, so the next thing we need to do is remove the spindle nut, like I said, and it's a 36 millimeter. So you can also use like a big breaker bar or something. I'm gonna use my 1/2-inch impact gun. So what we're gonna do is hold the pry bar here against the studs, because it's just spinning the whole hub assembly. So if we do this, we actually make progress instead of just kind of spinning our wheels. All right, the next thing we're going to do is take out this cotter pin here on the upper control arm castle nut. There we go. Okay, so now we're going to take a 13/16 socket and loosen this nut here. Now, I'll zoom out the camera. I have a jack underneath the lower control arm, and what we can do, and make sure you're safe while doing this, is lift this up so there's a little bit less tension on it while we're trying to loose it. Just make sure it's not going to fall off your jacking situation or something like that. So we want to make sure that's a nice position there. I have a little jack there. See, when you're on the ground and you're using jack and jack stands, you can just use a jack and do it. It's actually a little bit easier. But since we're on a lift, we do it this way. The castle nut is basically on finger tight now. What we want to do is leave that castle nut on there like that, because we need to break that ball joint loose. And you can do that with shocking with a hammer. You could use a pickle fork to go in between here. There we go. So we can see that it is broken. You know, it's broken loose. Jack it back up like this, and then there we go. And so it's broken loose, and it's just kind of hanging out right there. Go ahead and give you a little tour of the setup. So I have my screw jack here. This could be replaced if you're on the ground with a floor jack, obviously. And it's just kind of supporting there. So I've broken it loose, but I made sure to keep the castle nut on there so it doesn't just go wherever it wants to. Now we can let it down in a controlled manner. Now you can see we can lift the upper control arm up and out of its home, and this will give us access. So the next thing we're going to do is take off these bolts that hold the CV axle to the differential flange there, and they're 12 point. Use a 12 millimeter socket. It's important you need to have somebody holding the lugs with a pry bar, or else it's just going to spin into oblivion. And there you go, there's one. And the other 5 are just like it, so remove those. There we go. Yeah, there you go. Okay, so there we go. We can navigate that down. Up and over the sway bar link, and the CV axle is out. All right, so what you're looking at here is our old CV axle here. You can see where our problem was. And this is our new unit, and what you want to look at is you want to make sure you have the right amount of holes here. You have the same kind of spline fit here as far as length and consistency of the teeth on the spline, and just overall length comparison of the unit, because it has to be identical or it won't work. So this is exactly the same as that. It's ready to go in the car. I've left a link down below in the description to this exact unit. Okay, so the next thing we're gonna do is take some carburetor spray and spray it on that axle flange. And then we're gonna clean it. Just make sure that mating surface is nice and clean. And there we go. Now we can put the CV axle in. So insulation is gonna be the reverse of the removal, where we need to kind of fish it up here. Like that. Once it's in this position, it's really not going to fall out. So what we need to do is fish it into the hub assembly here. So what I want is this to be... Oh, never worked.
Do that.
Once this is lined up, it'll go together fairly easily. And look into the amount of tilt from the spindle, because if this tilt isn't correct, that's never going to go in. So now we have some flexibility to bolt it to the actual differential. So before we do anything, we're going to go ahead and replace this nut at least a little bit, so it can't just, you know, fall out while we're trying to work. Don't tighten it down just yet. Leave it how it is, just kind of finger tight. So the next thing we're going to do is replace these bolts here, and it helps to have, you know, a helper kind of holding this to the CV axle to the flange here, so you can get them lined up and on easier. All right, so you're looking at the bottom side of that flange there, and we're going to go around and snug up the bolts here, but we're going to do our best to do this in a star pattern like the diagram on screen, basically like lug nuts. Think about how you do a star pattern with a lug nut, same exact thing. So I want to also note that this is not the final tightness I'm going to go with, because the torque spec is like 110 foot-pounds to 140 foot-pounds, so anywhere in that range is good. So this is going to be our setup here. Again, we're going to have this jack and that's going to lift up our spindle up until it can reach on the ball joint stud up there. So that's what we're going to be working with. Again, if you were working on the floor, you could use a floor jack. That's actually a little bit more conventional than what I'm doing here. So once it's kind of in a tone there, we can grab our jack and give it a few pumps. So what you can do at this point is bring the upper control arm down with your left hand and put the nut on with your right. And we know that's nice and secure. So now what we can do is tighten that nut up. There we go. We relieve the tension off the jack, and that's going to give us the tension we need in order for that spindle not to spin. Because this spindle will spin if this is not going on with enough tension, so you can relieve that tension off the jack and get it out of here. But we need to make sure that one of the castle divots there lines up so we can get a cotter pin in. There we go. Next thing we can do is replace that cotter pin with a new one. Don't try to reuse your old ones. Go with a new one and make sure it's big enough to where it's going to occupy as much of that space as possible. So what we want to do is put the long side down so we can bend that around. And this is a little bit long on both sides actually. We're going to cut this like that. And then on this one, just like that, and that's replaced. Okay, so while I'm tightening those 12-point bolts on the flange there, I'm gonna have a helper holding the lugs like this with a nice big pry bar, because there's going to be a lot of force. You have to have somebody do this or else you're just tightening against yourself. So with that out of the way, we can go ahead and tighten those 12 points. Alright, so I've got my torque wrench loaded up here at 110 foot-pounds. So I need my helper to hold on to those studs like I discussed earlier, and we're going to go ahead and tighten everything in a star pattern. I'm going to show you how to do this one, but you need to do all 6 in a star pattern. There we go. And do that for all 6, and that's not going anywhere. Just make sure you do it in an even star pattern. Okay, so now we can take our 36mm socket. You can do this with a breaker bar because this is a large nut. It needs to be on pretty tight. So if you want to use a torque wrench and do it that way, you can, but the impact gun's pretty good, and really tight with a big breaker bar is what you're going to be looking at. So now we can put on this, not sure what you'd call it exactly, but it holds the nut here in place so you can put a cotter pin in and it won't walk off. Okay, so now we have the retainer in there. We can go ahead and bend the cotter pin around it and make sure this isn't going to come off. And then we can snip the small tail here. Make sure your eyes are closed. There we go. And now we can put the brakes back on. Next thing we can do is put the rotor on. Fairly easy. Now we can put on the bracket that holds our brake caliper here. Make sure these are nice and tight. They are pretty darn big bolts. We grab our 18mm socket and tighten those up, and they're pretty tight. There we go. Now we can put our brake pads back on. Nice and easy. Make sure those are nice and squished and the rotor is fully seated. Then we can put the caliper back on. Okay, so that's nice and secured there. Alright, and these slide bolts here, or the bolts on the slides I should say, are 13mm, but you guys remember that. You guys are smart. Make sure that's nice and snug. Just, arm tight is good. If I find a torque spec, I'll go ahead and put it on screen for you, but if you don't have a torque wrench, it's understandable. Arm tight's good. Alright, so that is how to replace the CV axle for your Ford F-150 or Expeditions around that era. It's a little tricky, but not impossible for someone to do in their garage and save a ton of money doing it, because this is something a shop would charge you at least a couple $100s for just the labor. So with all of that said, thank you so much for watching. If you have any confusion, go ahead and leave some comments down below. I'll do my best to answer you down there. Thanks so very much for watching again. Make sure you're subscribed, and I'll see you next time.